Hi, friends. Welcome to Know Thy Soul, where we explore the stories, symbols, and truths that teach us how to have eyes that see. I've been working on this podcast for months, and if I'm being honest, it's been years, maybe even my whole life. And one of the things I realized while writing these episodes is that this podcast is really about a tapestry. The challenge that I've had to work through is that in a 20, 30, 60-minute episode, I can only show you a tiny piece of it. I can maybe show you one thread or one image, but those things are part of a much larger design. Imagine if I handed you a single thread and said, "Can you see the tapestry? Do you understand it?" You'd be like, girl, no, this is a thread. Now, it might be a beautiful thread, and it might even help you understand something about your life, but you still wouldn't know how it connects to the larger tapestry. You wouldn't know where it came from, you wouldn't know where it's going, and you certainly wouldn't know what picture it's helping to create. And one of the biggest problems I see in our world is that we're constantly encouraged to zoom in. Let's talk about the symptom, the problem, the wound, or the thing right in front of us. And trust me, I used to be queen of this. My attention would narrow until all I could see was the thing right in front of me. And when that happens, we stop asking where this moment fits into the larger journey. We stop asking what it might be trying to teach us. We stop asking what story we're actually living. But when all we can see is the tree directly in front of us, we lose sight of the forest. That's what these stories help us recover, the ability to step back and see the larger landscape, to see where we've been, where we are, and where the path might be leading. So, in this podcast, I want to help you see the forest first. Then we'll spend the rest of our time exploring the trees. We'll explore other maps, other stories, other symbols, and other threads in the tapestry. And we'll meet fellow travelers along the way. But before we do that, I want you to have a sense of the larger picture they're all pointing toward. And maybe that's why we're drawn to stories in the first place, because there's something inside us asking bigger questions. Not just what happened, but why? Not just where are we going, but where does all of this fit? Something keeps pulling us back to the bigger picture, back to the larger story, back to wondering what it all means. Questions like, what's the pattern here? What's the lesson? What is life trying to teach me? Why am I here? Or what does any of this mean? Have you ever looked up at the night sky and felt that? That moment where, just for a second, life gets bigger than your to do list, bigger than your problems, bigger than your plans. I think that's where the tapestry begins to reveal itself. Because when we can see the larger story, something shifts. Things that felt random don't seem quite so random anymore. Things that felt like endings sometimes turn out to be beginnings. And times when we felt completely alone and misunderstood begin to feel a little less lonely. We start to realize that maybe we're not the first person to walk this path. And that's really what I hope to offer you in these opening episodes. Not answers, but a map. Or maybe a better way to say it is a framework, a way of understanding the journey itself. A map gives us orientation. You know, when you're standing in front of one of those giant directory maps at the mall, the very first thing you're looking for is the little star that says, "You are here." And I think that's what we've got to find for ourselves inside this tapestry. Not where we wish we were, not where we think we should be, just an honest understanding of where we actually are. Because if you don't know where you are, it's pretty hard to know where to go next. And the good news is that countless people have walked this path before us. That's really what these stories are. People leaving breadcrumbs, people saying, "I was here once too. Here's what helped, and here's what I learned." But they can't walk this path for us. At some point, we still have to take the next steps ourselves. And here's the funny thing, the destination isn't really a destination. I know people say that all the time, but the longer I do this work, the more true it seems. You don't arrive one day and think, well, I guess I'm enlightened now. At least that's never happened for me. There's an Eastern parable that says, what do you do before enlightenment? You cook, you clean, you do the dishes. And what do you do after enlightenment? You cook, you clean, you do the dishes. Life still looks like life. You still have relationships. You still have challenges. You still have the dishes. But something about the way you experience it changes. The destination is really a return to yourself, but somehow you come back seeing yourself differently than before. T.S. Eliot said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we first started and know the place for the first time." I love that because that's exactly what it feels like. Not becoming someone new, but like finally becoming who you've been all along. You begin relating to yourself differently. You relate to other people differently. You move through the world differently. And perhaps that's what it means to know thy soul. So for today, I want to zoom out and help you see how two foundational stories relate to one another. These stories are the Handless Maiden and the story of Perceval in the Fisher King. Then, in the next episodes, we're going to start zooming back in to look more closely at both. We'll follow the threads, explore the symbols, and see what they might have to teach us about our lives. But first, a caveat that I'll probably have to repeat again and again throughout this podcast. Stories speak in symbols, and very often a man and a woman in a story represent different aspects of our own psyche. Generally speaking, the man represents the part of us that acts, strives, protects, achieves, and moves outward in the world. The woman represents the part of us that feels, receives, nurtures, relates, and turns inward. But don't get too attached to the characters themselves. Stories aren't always that literal. Sometimes a story uses two men, sometimes it uses two women. Sometimes the symbols are split across several characters. The question isn't whether the character is male or female. The question is, what part of the human experience is that character helping us to see? But here's where it gets tricky. Both men and women have both. Every one of us has an inner masculine and an inner feminine, an ego and a soul, a part that moves out into the world, a part that turns inward, a part that acts and a part that listens, a part that seeks and a part that knows. And as we'll discover and dive deeper into a future episode, the inner world and the outer world mirror one another. Or as many spiritual traditions put it, as above, so below, as within, so without, or on earth as it is in heaven. So these stories can be read on multiple levels. They can tell us something about the psyche, something about relationships, something about men and women, something about humanity, and something about the journey of becoming whole. And yes, I do think many men will naturally recognize themselves in Percival, and many women will recognize themselves in the Handless Maiden, not because the stories belong exclusively to either sex, but because these stories emerged from a world where men largely held social, political, economic, and religious power, while women often lived with the consequences of decisions they had little power to influence. The stories reflect that reality. Men rode into battle, men ruled kingdoms, men made laws, men controlled the institutions. And yet, behind that power was often another kind of wound. A boy who learned that love had to be earned. A boy who learned that feelings were dangerous. A boy who learned that his value depended on what he could do rather than who he was. So he learned to perform, to achieve, to conquer, to provide, to endure, to wear armor. His nervous system learned to stay in fight mode, always striving, always proving, always preparing for the next battle. And after a while, he forgot where the armor ended and he began. Women were often denied agency in every sense of their lives, and in some places still are. They were denied access to education, positions of leadership, and political power. Their voices carried less weight. Their ideas were dismissed. Their contributions were frequently credited to someone else. Their stories were often left out of the history books altogether. They were told what to believe, whom to marry, when to speak, and when to remain silent. They had to bear children whether they wished to or not. They were expected to have sex with their husbands whether they wished to or not, and in many places they didn't have the right to say no. They remained in marriages where they were abused, neglected, or treated as property. Their survival depended on the men around them, first their fathers or brothers, then their husbands, and eventually their sons. They were told what was appropriate to think, what was appropriate to feel, what was appropriate to want, and what was appropriate to become. So their nervous system learned a different survival strategy: to accommodate, to appease, to endure, to make themselves smaller, to ignore their own needs, to doubt their own knowing, to wait for permission, and ultimately to survive. Now, of course, reality is never that simple. Men learned how to accommodate too, and women learned how to fight. These are human wounds, not gendered ones. A wounded man is often more likely to challenge someone directly, sometimes physically, and therefore the scars are easier to see. A wounded woman is often more likely to attack through relationships, through reputation, through exclusion, through getting the tribe to turn against the person she perceives as a threat. One battles with fists, the other battles with belonging. Both are forms of weapon and armor. Both are attempts to protect something vulnerable underneath. So while it may appear that men held the power in the outer world, something important was missing. Because domination is not the same thing as power. Control is not the same thing as freedom. And a man who must constantly wear armor is not free. In the inner world, everyone is wounded. The system, what many call patriarchy, wounds women and men in different ways, but it wounds both. The truth is that everyone learns survival strategies, men and women alike. Some learn to fight, some learn to please, some learn to dominate, some learn to disappear, some learn to wear armor, some learn to hand their power away. And many of us learn several of these at the same time. And that's exactly why these stories still matter. While the symbols may have emerged from a particular moment in history, the wounds they point to are timeless. And now, to be clear, much has changed since these stories were first told. And thank God for that. But if we're honest, it might be worth asking, how much has really changed? The armor looks different, the roles look different, the rules look different, but the wounds are still with us. Both men and women are still taught what is acceptable to think, what is acceptable to feel, what is acceptable to want, and what is acceptable to become. The message for both men and women is the same. There are parts of you that are acceptable. There are parts of you that must be hidden, parts of you that belong, and parts of you that do not. Some learn to disconnect from their agency, and others learn to disconnect from their vulnerability. Some learn to abandon themselves, and some learn to hide themselves. Different wounds, the same loss of wholeness. But don't make the mistake of thinking Perceval is only about men or that the Handless Maiden is only about women. Because if we stay with these stories long enough, something surprising begins to happen. The boundaries start to blur, and the Handless Maiden begins to look a little like Perceval, and Perceval begins to look a little like the Handless Maiden. Now, I know some of what I may say may trigger people, but you'll see in these stories that the truth is what we need to heal. Triggers should be used as mirrors, not bullets. They help us see where we are in the tapestry, and sometimes they reveal what is asking to be healed next. Nothing in this podcast is meant to call men out or women out. If anything, it's meant to call us up, to bring what has been hidden into light, to make the unconscious conscious, and to transform what has been wounded. Because ultimately, these are not two different journeys. They're the same journey told through two different stories. And they mirror one another in fascinating ways. You cannot truly go on one journey without going on the other. The Handless Maiden approaches the journey through feeling. Perceval approaches it through thinking. She approaches it through relationship. He approaches it through achievement. She begins disconnected from her own agency. He begins disconnected from his own heart. Both teach us what happens when we lose connection to the soul, and both reveal what must be healed. The maiden must learn to trust herself. Perceval must learn to turn toward the wound. She must learn not to abandon herself for the sake of others. He must learn not to abandon others for the sake of himself. Neither is wrong, neither is right, but both are incomplete without the other. The real journey is learning how to hold both, self and other, thinking and feeling, doing and being, inner and outer. This is the sacred marriage, and perhaps what many traditions point toward when they speak of the middle way. So today, I want to give you the bird's eye view of these two stories. I want you to see the larger pattern before we start zooming in. Then, over the next few episodes, we'll dive deeper into the stories themselves, and we'll follow the threads and explore the symbols and see what they might have to teach us about our own journey. So without further ado, here is the story of the Handless Maiden. Once upon a time, there was an impoverished miller, And one day, while chopping wood in the forest, he encountered a mysterious man who promised him great riches in exchange for whatever stood behind his mill. The miller thought, this is an easy bargain. Surely the man meant the apple tree in his garden, so he agreed. The stranger promised to return in 3 years to collect what was his. And when the miller arrived home, he found his household overflowing with wealth and his mill running effortlessly. But when he told his wife what had happened, her face grew pale. "You fool," she cried. "That was no ordinary man. It was the devil. And our daughter was sweeping behind the mill when you made that bargain." 3 years passed, and on the day of the devil's arrival, the maiden washed herself clean and drew a white circle around her. The devil returned to claim his prize, but when he reached for the maiden, he couldn't take her because she was pure of heart, and he didn't dare cross the white circle. The devil then commanded that the father take away every access she had to water, and the father did as he was told. But when the devil returned the following day, the maiden's hands were sparkling clean because she had wept over them. Enraged, the devil demanded that her father cut off her hands, and if the father refused, the devil would take him instead. Terrified, the father turned to his daughter and told her he had no choice. And the maiden willingly raised her arms, and her father severed her hands. On the third day, the devil returned once again to claim her, but she had wept all over the stumps where her hands had been, and he could not take her. Furious, he departed. The father acknowledged how much wealth he had obtained because of her and promised his daughter that she would never want for anything. He would provide for her. She would never need to work again. But the maiden knew she could not remain. She said she must leave and seek people who would show her sympathy, to which her father replied that such people were seldom found. Yet she left anyway. Alone and handless, she wandered into the forest. After a long journey, she came upon a beautiful pear orchard surrounded by a moat. Hungry and exhausted, she prayed for help. And that night, an angel appeared and parted the waters of the moat, allowing her to cross safely into the orchard. Unable to pluck a pear from the tree, she reached up with her mouth and ate a single pear. The orchard belonged to a king, and since every pear in the orchard had been carefully counted and numbered, the next morning he immediately noticed that one was missing. Curious, he kept watch the following night, and there he saw the maiden. He witnessed her purity, her resilience, and the strange circumstances of her arrival, and he fell in love with her. He made the maiden his queen, and he promised that he would never forsake her. And because she had no hands, he commissioned a pair of beautiful silver hands for her. Only about a year after their marriage, the king was called away to war. And before leaving, he entrusted his wife to the care of his mother and instructed her to send word if the queen gave birth during his absence. And in time, the queen gave birth to a beautiful son. The king's mother immediately sent a messenger to tell the king the news, but the devil intercepted the message and changed it. And when the message reached the king, it falsely reported that the queen had given birth to a monster. The king sent word back that his wife and child should be protected until he returned home. But once again, the devil intercepted the message and altered it. When the king's mother received the reply, it commanded her to kill the queen and cut out her eyes and tongue as proof. The king's mother was horrified. She couldn't bring herself to carry out such a terrible act. Instead, she secretly sent the queen and her child away and used the eyes and tongue of a deer as evidence. And so, for the second time, the maiden entered the forest. Carrying her child, she wandered alone through the wilderness. Again, she prayed for help, and again help appeared. Deep within the forest, she discovered a small house bearing a sign over the door that read, "Here all dwell free." An angel welcomed her inside, and there she found shelter, food, rest, and safety. The angel helped care for her son and gave her a place to heal. Years passed, 7 long years, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the maiden's hands began to grow back. Meanwhile, the king returned home from war. Immediately upon entering the castle, he asked for his wife and child, and his mother began to weep. As the truth unfolded, he discovered the devil's deception and the terrible chain of events that had separated them. The king wept for his lost wife and child. But the king's mother assured him that the maiden and his son still lived, but had been sent into the forest 7 years ago. Without hesitation, the king left the castle and set out to find them. He vowed to search until they were found. And so the king, too, wandered through the forest. For 7 years he searched. He did not eat or drink. He was sustained only by nourishment from God, until at last he came upon the little house with the sign, "Here all dwell free." The angel welcomed him inside. He immediately asked about his wife and child, but instead of answering, the angel offered him something to eat and drink. But he was so tired that he lay down to rest, and the angel placed a white cloth over his face. The angel then went to tell the maiden that her husband had come. Yet she remained skeptical. Then the cloth fell from the king's face. The maiden asked her son to place it back over him, but the child replied that he thought he had no father on earth, only the one he prayed to in heaven. The king heard their voices and woke up. At first, he didn't recognize her. After all, this woman had hands. He said her face was the same, her voice was the same, but his wife had silver hands. Then the angel brought forth the old silver hands, and the king knew. At last they were reunited. Overcome with joy, he cried, "A heavy stone has fallen from my heart." The king, the queen, and their son returned home together, and there was great rejoicing throughout the kingdom. And now I want to tell you the story of Perceval and the Fisher King. Long ago, a youth and his widowed mother lived deep within a forest. The youth knew almost nothing of the world beyond the forest. He didn't even know who he was. One day, while wandering through the forest, he heard a strange noise, armor clanking, horses moving through the trees. At first, he thought devils were approaching. Then he caught sight of them. Knights. Their armor shone in the sunlight. Their shields gleamed. They seemed so magnificent that at first he mistook them for angels. The youth ran toward them in wonder. He asked question after question. What's a knight? What was a lance? Who had given them the armor? And where could he find the king who made knights? Something awakened inside him, and for the first time he saw a life beyond the forest. And in that moment, he decided that he too would become a knight. When he returned home and told his mother what he had seen, she was devastated. She told him how years earlier his father had been grievously wounded in both thighs and crippled for life. Hoping to restore the family's honor, his two older brothers also became knights. One died of wounds he suffered in combat. The other was killed in battle, his body left for crows and ravens to peck at. When the news of the elder brother's death reached the father, grief overcame him and he died. Terrified of losing her last remaining child, the youth's mother withdrew from the world and raised him in isolation. But the youth scarcely listened. His thoughts were fixed on the knights he had seen, on their armor, their horses, and their weapons, and the life he suddenly wanted for himself. When she realized she could not keep him there any longer, she prepared him for the journey. She told him to help women in distress wherever he could. If a maiden freely offered him a ring, he could graciously accept it. If she offered him a kiss, he could accept that as well. She urged him to seek the company of honorable people, to go to church often and pray. She warned him not to be too talkative and to think before he spoke, and she dressed him in a rough homespun garment of her own making. Then she watched him ride away. When he had gone only a stone's throw from the house, he turned and looked back. His mother had fallen to the ground. She lay motionless as though she were dead, yet the youth rode on. Not long after leaving home, the youth came upon a richly decorated tent. Inside was a young maiden sleeping alone. Remembering his mother's advice, he kissed her, took the ring from her finger, and rode away believing he had done exactly as he had been instructed. But when the maiden's lover discovered the missing ring, he accused her of betraying him. Though she told him what had happened, he refused to believe her and cast her out. Eventually, the youth encountered a red knight outside King Arthur's court. The knight boasted that he had stolen the king's golden cup, splashed its wine across the queen, and claimed Arthur's lands as his own. When the youth repeated the knight's words to Arthur, he found the king deep in sorrow over what had happened. But the youth gave little thought to the king's grief. He asked only one question: "Will you make me a knight?" Arthur told him that if he could defeat the Red Knight, he could have the knight's armor. And as the youth left the hall, a maiden looked upon him and smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 6 years. And she declared that one day he would become the greatest knight in the world. At that very moment, the fearsome Red Knight arrived and insulted King Arthur. No one dared to challenge him, but the youth stepped forward immediately. Though he knew almost nothing about combat, he fought the Red Knight and killed him with a single dagger to his eye. Then, with help, he stripped the knight of his armor and put it on, over his homespun garment, despite his helper suggesting he also takes the knight's fine clothes, and he rode away on the Red Knight's horse. At last, he believed he had become a knight. When King Arthur heard the news, he thought the youth would be as good as dead without any formal training of combat. But soon afterward, the youth met an older knight named Gornemont, who, over the course of a single evening, taught him the basic skills of knighthood. Yet the youth spoke of little besides his mother. Gornemont invited him to remain longer, but the youth insisted he must leave the very next day to learn whether his mother was alive or dead. The next morning, Gornemont presented him with a fine silk garment to wear beneath his armor. And at first, the youth refused. How could anything be finer than the homespun clothing his mother had made? But Gornemont persuaded him, and he accepted the gift. Before he departed, Gornemont urged him never to strike an unarmed knight, to help women in distress, to go to church and pray, not to speak too much or to ask too many questions, lest people think him foolish, and to stop telling everyone what his mother had taught him. With that, the youth rode on. Later, the young boy arrived at a kingdom under siege. Its lady, Blanchefleur, was on the verge of losing everything. The castle was starving. Its defenders were losing hope. Yet when the people saw the young knight, they sensed that help had finally arrived. That night, Blanchefleur came to his chamber in great distress. The youth listened. He comforted her, and the two spent the night together in affection and tenderness. By morning, something had changed. He was no longer fighting merely for adventure. He was fighting for Blanchefleur. So he rode out against her enemies. He fought for her. He saved her kingdom and drove away those who sought to destroy it. The people celebrated. Blanchefleur begged him to stay, but the young knight could not forget the mother he had left behind, and so he rode away once more, continuing his search. Continuing his journey, the youth reached a river. There he saw a nobleman fishing from a boat. The young knight asked where he might find lodging. The fisherman replied that there was no lodging nearby except at his own dwelling, and gave him the directions to reach it. He told him to continue along the river and described how to find the castle. Following the directions, the young knight soon arrived at a magnificent castle. He was warmly welcomed. There he discovered that the fisherman from the river was the lord of the castle. The nobleman suffered from a mysterious infirmity. He could not move about freely and appeared wounded or disabled. Yet despite his suffering, he treated his guest with great generosity and honor. The young knight was given food, lodging, and every courtesy. As night fell, a strange procession moved through the hall. A squire carried a bleeding spear. Others carried golden candelabra, and a radiant maiden entered carrying the Grail itself. Its light filled the hall. The lord of the castle sat watching in silence. The young knight knew something was wrong. His host was suffering. The spear was bleeding. The Grail was shining. Questions rose within him. What was the Grail? Why did the spear bleed? What affliction burdened the lord of the castle? But every time he considered asking, he remembered the advice he had received. Do not ask too many questions. And so he remained silent. The next morning, the castle was empty, his host was gone, and the Grail was gone. Not long after leaving the Grail castle, the young knight encountered a maiden mourning beside the body of a dead knight. When she saw him, she was struck by how clean and well fed both he and his horse appeared. She asked where he had spent the night. When the young knight described the castle, she immediately understood. There was no lodging nearby. The young knight had stayed at the Fisher King's castle. The maiden then revealed a terrible truth. The opportunity he had missed at the Grail Castle had been real. Had he asked the questions in his heart, the Fisher King, who was wounded through both thighs, would have been healed, the kingdom restored, and great suffering would have ended. The young knight was devastated. What he had believed was wisdom had become a terrible mistake. Then the maiden asked him his name, and the answer came to him suddenly, as though it had been waiting within him all along. For the first time he knew. Perceval. At that, the maiden revealed that she was his cousin, and she told him another painful truth. His mother had died from grief after he left home. For the first time, Perceval began to understand the consequences of his actions. Perceval rode on until he encountered another maiden riding a pony so thin its ribs showed through its skin. Her clothes were tattered, and she was weeping. She told Perceval that she was the very maiden whose ring he had taken and whom he had kissed in the tent. When her jealous lover discovered the missing ring, he assumed she had betrayed him, and since that day, she said, he had stripped her of her fine clothes, forced her to ride a starving horse, and treated her with great cruelty. As she spoke, the knight himself appeared. Rather than deny what had happened, Perceval confessed that he had taken the kiss and the ring himself, but swore that he had not dishonored the maiden in any way. The knight challenged him to combat. Before long, Perceval struck him from his horse and left him wounded and defenseless upon the ground. Remembering Gornemont's advice never to kill an unarmed knight, Perceval spared his life. Instead, he commanded the knight to restore the maiden to the honor and dignity she had once known, and when they were reconciled, the knight was to present himself before King Arthur's court and surrender in Perceval's name. After this encounter, Perceval continued his wandering in search of adventure. One winter day, King Arthur and his knights came upon a strange sight. Perceval sat alone in the snow, staring at 3 drops of blood. The red blood against the white snow reminded him of Blanchefleur. Lost in memory, he scarcely noticed the world around him. Several knights challenged him. He defeated them almost without thinking. Only Gawain approached him with understanding rather than force. At last, Perceval returned to Arthur's court. By now, he was celebrated throughout the kingdom. Then, on the 3rd day of celebrations, an old woman named Kundry rode into court. She was so unusual in appearance that many considered her grotesque, yet she carried a truth no one else was willing to speak. Before everyone present, she condemned him. She told the court that he had failed at the Grail Castle, that he could have healed the wounded king, that he could have restored the kingdom, and that because of his silence, suffering that might have ended continued throughout the land. The humiliation shattered him. He swore that he would not cease to fight or spend 2 nights in the same place until he found the Grail Castle again. 5 years pass. Perceval wandered the world searching for answers. During those 5 years, he never once entered a church. He never prayed. He never turned his thoughts toward God. Consumed by battles, adventure, and worldly pursuits, he had forgotten the very thing his mother had once urged him to remember. Then, on Good Friday, Perceval encountered a group of pilgrims. They were astonished to find a knight riding in armor on the holiest day of the year. Ashamed that he had forgotten even the holy day itself, he followed their advice and sought out a hermit living in the wilderness. For the first time in years, the knight who had spent his life fighting battles stopped and turned inward. He laid his armor aside and entered the hermit's chapel where the old man was at prayer. Perceval fell to his knees and wept. He confessed everything that had happened, how he had failed to ask why the lance bled, how he had never asked to whom the Grail served, and the hermit listened quietly. Then, upon learning his name, he revealed that Perceval's mother had actually been his sister, and that the wounded Grail King was his own brother. He told Perceval that his greatest failing was not simply that he had remained silent at the Grail Castle, but that compassion had failed to move him. His mother's prayers, the hermit said, had protected him all those years, for she had died grieving after he rode away, entrusting him to God's care. The hermit taught him about repentance, prayer, and God's mercy. He urged him to receive communion, to seek forgiveness, and to place his trust not in his own strength, but in God. Perceval confessed his sins, bowed his head in repentance, and received absolution. He remained with the hermit through Good Friday. His horse was cared for, and together they shared a simple meal. On Easter, Percival received communion. Then he mounted his horse and rode on once again. And here, unexpectedly, the original story ends. The poet never tells us whether Percival finds the Grail Castle again. He never tells us whether the wounded king is healed. He never tells us whether the kingdom is restored. The story simply breaks off. Perhaps that's because the Grail quest was never merely about courage, adventure, or feats in the outer world. It was always about the transformation of the heart, about learning to see with compassion, about communion with God. Perhaps this is Percival's own Good Friday and Easter, not the completion of his transformation, but its beginning. The old way of living, driven by appearances, achievement, and unquestioned obedience, begins to die, and something new begins to awaken within him. Until now, Percival has learned to become a knight. Here, he begins to learn how to become a whole human being. Perhaps that's fitting, because none of us finish this journey in a single story. We don't arrive all at once. We keep writing, we keep learning, we keep returning to God, and maybe that's been the Grail quest all along. Later writers would continue the tale. Some say Percival eventually returned to the Grail Castle. Some say he finally asked the healing question. Some say the question was, to whom does the Grail serve? Others say it's, what ails thee? And in those later tellings, the wounded king is healed, the kingdom is restored, and Percival returns to Blanchefleur. But the original author leaves us with something different. Not an answer, a quest. A young knight who has only just begun to awaken, who has finally discovered that the greatest battles are not fought with a sword, that wisdom is not found in victory, strength, or fame, but in compassion, in the willingness to notice another's suffering, and in having the courage to ask the questions. Now, before we start interpreting any of this, I just want you to notice something. Look at these stories side by side. The handless maiden loses her hands. Percival is told not to ask questions. She leaves home. He leaves home. She wanders through the forest. He wanders through the world. She encounters a king. He encounters Blanchefleur. She accepts silver hands. He puts on armor. Her king leaves the castle. Percival leaves the castle. She is controlled by the men around her. He moves through the world without truly seeing the women around him. Both enter a period of exile. Both spend years wandering. Both encounter a guide. She enters the here-all-dwell-free house with the angel. He enters the forest and meets the hermit. She lets go of the silver hands. He lays aside both the homespun garment and the armor. Both return. Both are restored. And both are reunited with what they had lost. Do you see it? These are not two different journeys. They're the same journey viewed from two different angles. So what are we actually looking at? I believe these are two versions of the same journey. The Handless Maiden tells the story from the perspective of the soul. Percival tells the story from the perspective of the ego. One begins with a wound to relationship, feeling, and inner knowing. The other begins with a wound to curiosity, perception, and the ability to see. One loses her hands, the other puts on armor. And both spend the rest of the story trying to recover what was lost, because neither the ego nor the soul can complete the journey alone. The soul cannot bring its gifts into the world without the ego, and the ego cannot fulfill its purpose without the guidance of the soul. And only when they begin working together can the journey home truly begin. And you may be thinking, this is interesting, Jen, but what does any of this have to do with my life? Well, more than you might think. At their heart, these stories describe two different ways we become separated from who we really are. The handless maiden abandons herself. Percival abandons relationship. One loses herself, the other loses the ability to truly see and love another. And I think most of us spend our lives living somewhere between these two stories. The handless maiden shows up anytime we surrender our agency. Anytime we know what we feel, what we want, or what we need, but struggle to act on it. Anytime we give away our authority and wait for someone else to save us. For example, you remember the story I shared about wanting to become an architect, but someone suggesting I become a civil engineer instead because I'd make more money. And I listened. That was a moment in my life where I lifted my hands and willingly allowed them to be cut off. I let my thinking mind make a decision without consulting what my soul already knew. Or the years I spent living in what looked like my dream life, the dream house or a successful career, my beautiful family or the polished social media profiles. And yet, something felt profoundly disconnected. That was my silver handed life. And those last several years, the years of solitude, the years of introspection, the years of writing and healing and questioning everything, that was my time in the Here All Dwell Free House, growing my hands back. But there's another way we lose ourselves, not by abandoning ourselves, but by abandoning relationship. Percival shows up anytime we hide behind armor, anytime we stay busy, productive, successful, or distracted so we don't have to face what hurts, anytime we stay in problem solving mode while avoiding the deeper wound underneath it, anytime something touches a wound inside us and instead of becoming curious, we become defensive. We fight, we flee, we shut down. Anything except ask the right questions. And if I'm honest, I spent most of my life both handless and armored. I achieved, I performed, I did what I was told, I followed the rules, I checked the boxes. I built the life I thought I was supposed to build. And from the outside, much of it looked successful. But underneath it all was a question I wasn't asking, a wound I wasn't facing. And like Percival, I kept riding outward long after my soul was asking me to turn inward. Most of us have lived both stories. I know I have. Percival's story is about a young, enthusiastic boy who hasn't yet learned to think about others. He follows what inspires him. He follows his curiosity. He follows his desires. But he has not yet learned relationship. Then the world begins teaching him who he thinks he should be, how to behave, how to fit in, how to become a man. And after being wounded for being different, Percival works very hard to ensure that no one sees behind the armor he has built, including himself. But beneath that armor sits a wounded king. The Handless Maiden is almost the opposite. She is a young, naive girl who thinks almost entirely about others and has not yet learned that her own needs matter. And after being wounded by her own father, she enters the world searching for someone to save her. And she finds him. But the king can only love her to the extent that he has learned to love himself. He offers her a life that looks beautiful on the outside, a castle, security, silver hands, but something essential is still missing. His wounds are too great, and he is a man at war with himself. And eventually those wounds force her into a long season of healing, a season where she learns that her needs matter, her feelings matter, her intuition matters. Meanwhile, the king begins a journey of his own. He too must confront his wounds. He too must leave the castle. He too must learn what love actually requires. And when they finally return, they are no longer the wounded couple they once were. They return as two people who have learned what neither could learn alone. One shows us what happens when we become disconnected from our own inner knowing. The other shows us what happens when the thinking mind, action, and achievement become separated from compassion, curiosity, and relationship. And when those two halves are torn apart, the wound doesn't just stay inside us. It begins shaping the families we build, the institutions we create, the cultures we pass on. Earlier, I said that the inner world is a mirror of the outer world. As within, so without. As above, so below. The same patterns that shape our souls eventually shape our civilizations. These stories aren't just describing individuals, they're describing cultures. Because when a pattern exists in the soul, it eventually expresses itself in the world. And once you start seeing the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. You see it in science, a field that has given us extraordinary gifts, but one that often struggles with anything that cannot be measured, quantified, observed, categorized, labeled, and placed neatly inside the king's numbered pear garden. You see it in religion, where entire traditions have elevated one face of God while silencing the other, where the feminine has been put to sleep, locked in a tower, and hidden behind carefully built walls that few dare to question. You see it in medicine, where the body has been divided into systems and specialties and parts, where we can explain the chemistry of a feeling while forgetting to ask what that feeling might be trying to tell us. You see it in education, where children arrive curious and full of questions, and then spend years learning which questions are acceptable to ask, how to behave in court, how to fit in, how to succeed within the system. You see it in our relationship with nature, We can explain photosynthesis. We can analyze soil samples. We can measure ecosystems. But many of us have forgotten how to sit beneath a tree and listen. You see it in business, where productivity is often valued more highly than presence, where burnout is worn like a badge of honor, where we ask what can be produced before we ask what is meaningful, where our worth becomes measured by what we do rather than who we are. You see it in the way we parent. We rush to solve our children's problems before we've learned to sit with their feelings. We teach them what to think long before we teach them how to listen to themselves. And you see it throughout history. For thousands of years, the feminine has quite literally had its hands cut off. Women were denied the right to own property, denied the right to vote, denied access to education, denied positions of authority. In many places, they were treated as the property of fathers and husbands rather than as sovereign human beings. The Handless Maiden isn't merely telling a personal story, she's telling a historical one. You see it whenever one group convinces itself it has the right to dominate another, between men and women, nations and nations, races, classes, even humanity's relationship with the natural world. The same pattern appears. We've forgotten how to know something without immediately dissecting it. We've forgotten how to trust our own experience. And perhaps most importantly, you see it in ourselves. In women who have been taught that everyone else's needs matter more than their own. In men who have been taught to conquer their feelings and others rather than understand them. In all of us who have learned to value achievement over a relationship, performance over presence, knowing over wisdom, armor over vulnerability. But this isn't only a story about men and women. Whenever relationship is sacrificed for power, whenever compassion is sacrificed for control, whenever intuition, imagination, and inner knowing are dismissed in favor of domination alone, the same pattern appears. The feminine loses its hands, the masculine loses its heart, and everyone suffers. This, to me, is the deeper truth beneath what people often call patriarchy. Not that men win and women lose, not that one side is good and the other is bad, but that whenever one way of being is elevated at the expense of another, everyone pays the price. Women pay the price, men pay the price, children pay the price, our relationship with one another pays the price, our relationship with the earth pays the price, and ultimately, our relationship with God pays the price. The wound doesn't stop with us. It spreads into our marriages, our families, our institutions, our cultures, until eventually the world itself begins reflecting the wound we've carried inside all along. And that is why these stories matter. Not because they tell us what happened long ago, but because they help us to see what is still happening now. But the stories don't end with the wound. They don't end with the king leaving the castle. They don't end with the hands being cut off. They don't end with armor, and they don't even end with exile. They end with restoration. The silver hands, the armor, and the homespun garment are shed. Hands grow back. Questions are welcomed. The king is hailed. The grail is restored. The lovers are reunited, and harmony returns. And perhaps that's why these stories have survived for centuries, because they remind us that the wound is not the end of the story. The question is whether we are willing to let it become the beginning of ours, whether we are willing to see what has been cut off, whether we are willing to face the wound, whether we are willing to ask the question. But it also raises an interesting point. The earliest version of Perceval ends differently than many people expect. It doesn't end with the Fisher King healed. It doesn't end with the Grail Castle restored. Instead, it ends with Perceval laying down his armor, confessing his failures, receiving communion on Easter, and riding away. In many ways, his inner journey has begun, but the outer story remains unfinished. The wound remains, the question remains, the kingdom remains unhealed. Some scholars believe the story was left unfinished because the author died before completing it. And perhaps that's true, but I can't help wondering if there's something symbolic about where the story stops. Not before Percival's transformation, but before the world's. We never see him return to the castle. We never hear him ask the healing question. We never watch the Fisher King restored. The story leaves that final step unwritten. Perhaps the story was never only about Percival. It was always about us, and we are invited to carry the story forward. The question is still waiting to be asked. The wound is still waiting to be healed. These stories are not just stories, they're invitations, a kind of choose your own adventures, and we're the ones holding the pens. The stories aren't about events, they're about inner transformations. And if you've listened this far, my guess is that you've already started to recognize pieces of yourself in one story or the other. Maybe you've spent your life building armor. Maybe you've spent your life growing hands. Maybe you've been living both stories at the same time. I know I have. In the next few episodes, we're going to slow down and look much more closely at these two stories. We're going to explore the father, the mother, the armor, the silver hands, Blanchefleur, the Fisher King, even the Grail, and the deeper patterns hidden beneath them. So before we end today, I'd like to ask you something. Do you believe our world could use a little more wisdom, a little more compassion, a little more balance between the masculine and feminine, and a deeper way of seeing? If you believe our world could benefit from remembering the wisdom that's been hidden in these stories all along, I hope you'll help these conversations find the people who are looking for them. Share this episode with someone who's searching for a deeper way of seeing. And if you haven't already, following the podcast and leaving a review helps these stories reach even more people. But for now, I simply want to leave you with a few questions. Where are you in the story? What has been cut off? What armor are you wearing? And what is your soul asking of you next? Until next time, my friends, may you know thy soul. It already knows the way.